G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here. Welcome to the tooth of May. 79 years down the track since Australia and America fought Japan during the Battle of the Coral Sea. And I got to say, my first order of business is to announce that I've woken up to myself and identified a big chunk of Autodidactic Dunning-Kreuger Effect in my interpretation of this map. That's not 0 degrees, that's 10 degrees south. That's 15 degrees south. Therefore, all of these positions I was talking about yesterday and the day before, around here and here, yeah, all bullshit. Up here, up here. This was going on here. That was going on there. Autodidactic Dunning-Kreuger Effect. Life's like that when you're teaching yourself how to suck eggs, eh? Here we go. Humble pie duly eaten. Crow swallowed while it's young and tender. Moving on to what happened on the 2nd of May 1942. A2420 RAAF mines. Pretty good view of RAAF mines back in the day for a newspaper clipping that came with the book. Vickers Supermarine Seagull, with which the RAAF's flying boat squadrons began. Very nice shot of a Catalina back in the day with its retractable floats coming up to reduce drag and provide a pretty good wingtip fence and cut back on vortexes and drag. Pin indicating RAAF mines. Catalina aircraft A2420, Captain Squadron Leader G. Hemsworth, Second Pilot Sergeant J. Coulter, travel and reconnaissance flight to Bowen. Was airborne RAAF mines, approximately 0600 hours local, waterborne Bowen, 1430 hours local. Flying Officer Mike Seymour and his crew as passengers to ferry damaged aircraft A2424 between Bowen and RAAF mines. Flying time 8 hours 30 minutes. Meanwhile, Townsville, A2412, a reconnaissance by Catalina aircraft A2412, Captain N. Fader, Second Pilot, Pilot Officer Tiny Lowbridge, was carried out between Townsville and Port Moresby. During the reconnaissance, they were diverted to search for a missing B-26, missing after operation against Rabaul. They would have been flying from Cairns or Townsville up over the Owen Stanleys, attacking Rabaul, which is out there in the off-camera area of the film. As daylight was fading, they were ordered to return to Moresby. No sighting. Airborne at 0723 hours local at Townsville. Waterborne at Moresby at 17 hours 55 minutes local time. Flying time 19 hours 32 minutes. From Tulagi Advanced Operating Base, aircraft A2418. A reconnaissance by aircraft A2418, Pilot Officer A.L. Norman, Second Pilot, Pilot Officer F.A.D. Dierks, was carried out over an area formed by lines joining positions, taking off from Tulagi to 11 degrees 20 south, 163 degrees east, 13 degrees 50 minutes south, 159.30 east, 11.50 south, and there 154 degrees east, 9 degrees south. For some strange reading, there's also a meridian line of 155 degrees east given there, after we've just defined the 4 points of a sort of a kite-shaped search area. So the aircraft was airborne at Tulagi at 0450 hours local time and waterborne at Moresby at 1750 local, after having searched that area along the way. The average visibility was 25 miles and cloud cover 2/10. Flying time 13 hours 40 minutes, which is a whole lot more believable than all of the work done with the pins yesterday. So I'm figuring that this is not quite as wrong as yesterday's effort, and those are the days before it. Moving on once again to Tulagi Advanced Operation Base, A2417, the crew of which we have some pictures. And I've been working on the assumption that with the juxtaposition, that's probably A2417 as well on the slipway at RAAF Bowen. So we have a reconnaissance by Catalina aircraft A2417. Sergeant C.W. Miller, second pilot Sergeant A. Lunnan from Tulagi, searching the area inside the lines from position 08 degrees 26 south, 1610 east. Below that, 161 degrees nothing east, which is there a mere maybe 15 miles, 20 miles flying from Tulagi. Bugger, forgive my geographical dyslexia, the top pin was in the wrong hole. And we'll say that we're now 50 miles from Tulagi as the first corner of the search, or it would have been in the wrong spot if I hadn't jumped from one of those readings to one of those readings while transposing from document to document, because, you know, such is life. So we'll pull that one out and just go back to my first description of the position. The next location on the square, so to speak, here we have another little bit of a mystery. 151 degrees 65 minutes east, which would be somewhere over there if you could have 65 minutes in a degree, and you can't. So I'm going to suggest that it's probably meant to be 156 degrees 51 minutes east, which puts it somewhere along the meridian there. And it's actually slightly past the edge of the map up there. So you'll just have to forgive the little bit of the squalid floor that shows in the background at the top of the frame. That's about the only way I can show you where the head of the pin is, so close to the edge of the map. But basically, take off from here, search that whole triangle there, and also Kiter and Isabel Island returning to Moresby. The aircraft was airborne at 0600 local and waterborne at Moresby at 1750 hours local. There were no sightings. The average visibility was 14 miles and cloud cover 110. Aircraft was taken over by Squadron Leader F. Chapman upon arrival at Port Moresby. It was the last aircraft out of Tulagi. Flying time 12 hours 44 minutes. And finally, on the 2nd of May 1942, again A2417 with a different crew and different pilot, Event F, chart number 1, where we have identification letter F and a line coming down pretty much to there, I think. We'll see how it transpires. F from Moresby, 2nd, 3rd May, A24-7, Frank Chapman. All-night flight to drop supplies to coast watchers. Malana, Ania Island, Kasserine, Augusta Bay, return to Cairns. So there we go, bit of a heads up. And behold, for once the map actually shows the location of Woodlark Island. So, taking off from Moresby, a reconnaissance by Catalina A2417, Captain, Squadron Leader F.B. Chapman, second pilot, Pilot Officer P.L. Marsh, and that was the crew that Jack Riddell was the flight engineer on, so the bloke who wrote this book was on this flight. Engaged in dropping stores at Mulliana, Ania Island, and Kasserine, Augusta Bay sighted an unidentified submarine at 0520 hours local in position 0810 degrees south, 153 degrees 30 minutes east. So, taking off from Moresby, once again, we're pretty close to the edge of the map, but that is Woodlark Island, and I'm assuming that these other islands are in that general vicinity. So the red marker pin is where the submarine is, there. Light was poor, dawn, and submarine submerged 2 minutes after sighting. Aircraft was airborne at Moresby, 19:15 local time, so 7:15 at night. Supplies were dropped successfully. Aircraft returned to Cairns on the 3rd of May 1942 at 11 hours and 40 minutes. Flying time 16 hours 30 minutes, which brings us to the end of May the 2nd. Okay, so 79 years ago, Tulagi was just about to be invaded. The RAAF have evacuated their advanced operating base, and all these fellas are en route via ship from the advanced operating base. Personnel from Tulagi to Villa travelling on the Bayless. And as I've said, at the time, these people really only knew what they were being told. They knew that they were stretched incredibly thin, and they thought that the Japanese were coming to invade Australia because that's what they were told. Australia was told that we were at imminent risk of invasion by the Japanese until as late as 1944. Australia was still so terribly terrified of being invaded by the Japanese. It doesn't show on this map, but down here somewhere there's a place called Rottnest Island. And on Rottnest Island, and I'm pretty sure on Kangaroo Island as well, they mounted anti-aircraft guns facing Antarctica in case the Japanese were going to come up at us from the south. The idea was to basically get all of Australia behind the war effort, which consisted of being a forward operating base for the Americans and then a rear area to resupply them with things like fresh vegetables, as well as workshop facilities, place to train for their island campaign, hopping their way towards Okinawa and Guam so that they could then later on invade Japan. But the people at the very top of the pyramid, they knew a bit more about what was going on. And I'm going to indulge in a bit of piracy at the moment. I think we're going to have a little bit of a look at World War II channels. There you go, if you want to go back and have a look at them. Assessment of the intelligence situation regards the Battle of the Coral Sea, what the Americans knew, what the Australians knew, what the Japanese thought they knew, what they were all trying to do. I think we're going to look at 6 minutes worth of pirated video.
This is World War II. Now, most of their warships searching for the Allied task force that had helped bomb Tokyo. They did not find them, but they did generate tons of radio traffic that has further helped the Allies crack their naval code. Germany launched a series of air raids against tourists. Shojiro Iida's 15th Japanese Army captures Lashio, terminus of the Burma Road, which had been the only overland supply route to Chiang Kai-shek's Chinese Nationalist Army. On May 1st, they take Mandalay, securing the terminus. Well, at 11:50 p.m. on the 30th, Burma Corps Commander Bill Slim gives the order to blow the Ava Bridge across the Irrawaddy River south of Mandalay after the British rearguard and the last of the refugee stragglers cross. The battle for Burma is over, but the long retreat is far from over. The route is up the Chinwin Valley, and Slim's men have to deal not only with trucks breaking down and running out of gas, not only with enormous columns of refugees, but also with constant air attacks, and they must constantly fight rearguard actions against the Japanese vanguard. They have a long way to go. But though they've lost Burma, the Allies are really trying to figure out where they can fight the Japanese. Now, the U.S. Office of Naval Communication is seriously improving at reading the Japanese naval codes, as I discussed last week. And after Admirals King and Nimitz have met in San Francisco, a meeting that began at the end of last week, they're aware of the scope of the coming Japanese attacks on Port Moresby and beyond. They absolutely want to maintain the secrecy of their intelligence gains, though, since they depend on that to gain any kind of initiative in the Pacific. King sees the Solomon Islands as the starting point for an offensive, so denying them and the Coral Sea to the Japanese is a must for him, to the point of wanting to commit the entire Pacific Fleet. But with Ranger and Wasp currently in the Atlantic and Mediterranean, a big defeat would mean they'd have basically nothing in the Pacific for the rest of the year until the Essex-class carriers are commissioned. So there's a real element of risk here. They decide to trust their intel. In a surprise move on April 30th, the Japanese fleet undertook to change their locator system. Their attempts to conceal the new system failed completely, however, when Hawaii intercepted a 4th Fleet message containing both old and new designators. So HIPO, the intelligence center on Hawaii, publishes its evaluation of the situation, to wit, the Port Moresby operation, MO, is now underway. It includes southeastern New Guinea, but Australia itself is not an objective either now or in the follow-up operations detected. They also list the forces Japan will use. Melbourne Intel Center disagrees with a few details, but they too are clear. The operation is now underway. They've deciphered messages that the operation begins when the 2 carriers diverted from Kido Butai heading home from the Indian Ocean reach base at Truk. This they do on April 28th. They leave Truk again on the 1st. Edwin Layton, the head of Pacific Fleet Intelligence, says landings in the New Guinea and Solomon Islands area will begin the 3rd, tomorrow. He says there'll be 20,000 or so men strong, with the carrier Division 5 carriers, Shokaku and Zuikaku, a bunch of cruisers, and a light carrier, which he believes to be the Ryukaku. He is wrong. It's Shoho. The enemy objective appeared to be to extend control from their New Guinea bases and Lai and Salamaua to Port Moresby at the top of the Papuan Peninsula. The advance was to be followed by a move into the Solomons to command the Coral Sea approach to Australia and to provide an air base from which to launch and advance south to Nomea in New Caledonia and onto Fiji to threaten to sever the sea route to the United States. The Japanese believed that one American carrier might be in the area, but that is not the case. A force has been assembled from 3 Allied task forces, TF-17 under Rear Admiral Fletcher with the carrier Yorktown, TF-11 Rear Admiral Fitch with the carrier Lexington, and TF-44 Rear Admiral Crease with American-Australian cruisers. Vice Admiral Halsey's Task Force 16 with carriers Enterprise and Hornet leaves Pearl Harbor on the 30th, but it's doubtful they can reach the region in time to be of service. Nimitz and King see these islands as a marine highway that they'll need for attacks on Rabaul, Japan's main airbase down there, and against Japan's southern perimeter. So they're sending in all they have. 7 battleships have joined the U.S. Pacific Fleet since Pearl Harbor, but there are not enough advanced bases or fast oilers to use them here. So they've been sent to mainland U.S. The carrier task forces are going to try to stop the Japanese here. Today, the Australian garrison at Tulagi, an island near Guadalcanal, is evacuated. The Japanese want to take Port Moresby. Their force is divided into 5 groups for this and smaller tasks. Admiral Takeo Takagi has the 2 fleet carriers, who are giving air cover for the whole operation. Admiral Aritomo Goto has 4 heavy cruisers and the light carrier Shoho, which is on its first combat mission after being commissioned some 6 months ago. She was originally built as a submarine tender but was converted last year. Goto's group is first to provide close support for landings at Tulagi to establish an airbase and then to help with overall operations. The main invasion force is coming from Rabaul, and Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue is in overall charge. The whole Japanese action is on a very strict timetable, with all actions to be completed by the 10th, so the two fleet carriers can rejoin the combined fleet for Isoroku Yamamoto's early June Midway offensive. So there is no time for them to hit the airfields of northern Australia to get air superiority over the Coral Sea. Admiral Inouye's final prediction as his 7 units sailed to execute this complex series of operations on both sides of the Coral Sea was, "It is not likely that powerful enemy forces are in the area." Yet his whole strategy was vitally dependent on surprise. His enemy is aware, though, of his plans. The world has never before seen a battle between aircraft carriers. It may do so very soon. In others fallen to the Japanese, and they've set their sights on Port Moresby, but the Allies plan to fight them for it, knowing their general plans from intelligence. You want to hear an absolutely brilliant quote from John Keegan that sums up Japan's situation at the beginning of May 1942? Sure you do. Okay. Their strategic horizon now ran around the whole Western Pacific and deep into China and Southeast Asia too. The historic European empires of the East, Burma, Malaya, the East Indies, the Philippines, and effectively French Indochina too, had been drawn into their sphere. To the Chinese dependencies to which they had established rights of occupation between 1895 and 1931, Formosa, Korea, and Manchuria, they had added since 1937 vast swaths of conquered land in China proper. All of the oceanic archipelagos north of the equator were theirs, and they had made inroads into those in the south. Between the west coast of the United States and the British dominions of Australia and New Zealand lay largely empty ocean, dotted by a few islands too remote or too tiny to provide their enemies with a base for a strategic riposte. From the perimeter of the southern area, the Japanese fleet and naval air forces were poised to strike deep into the Indian Ocean, towards the British Andaman and Nicobar Islands, towards Ceylon, perhaps even as far away as the coast of East Africa. Above all, their great amphibious, better, trifibious fleet remained intact. Not one of their 11 battleships, 10 carriers, or 18 heavy and 20 light cruisers had been even seriously damaged in the war thus far, while the United States Pacific and Asiatic fleets had lost, or lost the use of, all its battleships and large numbers of its cruisers and destroyers. The British and Dutch Far Eastern fleets had been destroyed, and the Royal Australian Navy had been driven back to port. All that remained to the Allies was set in a strategic balance against Japan's astonishing triumph and overpowering strategic position was the surviving naval base of Hawaii, with its remote dependency on Midway Island, and the U.S. Pacific Fleet's handful of carriers. Little wonder that hubris gripped even such doubters as Yamamoto at the beginning of May 1942. The consumption of victory, a prospect he had long warned hovered at the very margin of possibility, seemed to be only one battle away. Leaps and bounds in civil aviation, and if you want to learn more about that, TV, so we can keep getting better and better, do not forget to subscribe, and I will see you next time.
So yeah, as a thank you to World War II channel, I commend all of my viewers and subscribers who are not already subscribed to World War II channel, go and subscribe to them. So there we go, and now we know pretty much precisely where 11 and 20 Squadrons Royal Australian Air Force and their Catalinas are fitting into the grand strategy of the Battle of the Coral Sea, the story of which will be continued in the next thrilling episode of this handcrafted, homespun little hillbilly series. Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Ciao.